The moment Hillary Clinton looked straight into the camera and told Donald Trump that history would remember him as a criminal who belonged behind bars, she believed she was delivering the line that would finally settle a rivalry that had consumed American politics for nearly a decade. In her mind, the statement was not just an insult, but a verdict, one she expected millions of viewers to nod along with, as confirmation that time had proven her right. She assumed that years of headlines about investigations, indictments, and court battles had tilted the moral ground decisively in her favor. What she did not anticipate was that, by framing the exchange as a question of criminality, she was inviting a confrontation she had spent years avoiding. She had no way of knowing that the night would unfold less like a debate and more like a relentless cross-examination played out in front of a national audience. For months leading up to the broadcast, the idea of a Trump-Clinton rematch had lived mostly in the realm of speculation and political fantasy. Social media buzzed with hypothetical matchups, clips from 2016 resurfaced, and commentators argued over whether such a face-off would even be possible in the current climate. When Fox News announced that it had secured both participants for a televised debate-style event, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Supporters on both sides framed it as unfinished business, a chance to replay history with the benefit of everything that had come out since their last encounter. Critics called it reckless, unnecessary, and guaranteed to inflame divisions that had never truly healed. Donald Trump accepted the invitation almost instantly, signaling through aides that he had been waiting for such an opportunity. Hillary Clinton's team, by contrast, hesitated at first, weighing the risks of reopening controversies they believed were settled in the public mind. The decision to go forward reportedly came after a calculation that Trump's legal troubles had shifted public sympathy and weakened his standing. To Clinton and her advisors, the moment seemed ripe for vindication. A chance to say out loud what many of her allies had been repeating for years. They believed the audience would see a contrast between a candidate burdened by accusations and one who had already endured scrutiny. What Clinton's camp could not see was the extent to which Trump had reframed the event in his own mind. To him, the debate was not about policy contrasts or rhetorical flourishes, and it was certainly not about persuasion in the traditional sense. He treated it as an opportunity to assemble years of grievances into a single, coherent narrative designed for maximum impact. In the weeks leading up to the broadcast, he worked closely with advisors, researchers, and attorneys to organize material he believed had never been presented all at once. The goal was not to convince skeptics overnight, but to overwhelm the moment with documentation, timelines, and visual aids. By the time the lights came up in the New York studio, the atmosphere felt less like a political forum and more like a staged confrontation. The audience was carefully divided, with supporters of each figure clearly visible and a smaller group of undecided observers placed between them. Cameras panned across the room, capturing a mix of anticipation, anxiety, and barely concealed hostility. The set itself emphasized drama, with oversized screens positioned behind the podiums and lighting designed to draw attention to every reaction. Even the moderator appeared aware that the evening might quickly move beyond the boundaries of a conventional debate. Hillary Clinton entered first, greeted by enthusiastic applause from her side of the room and restrained acknowledgement from the rest. She wore a crisp white suit that echoed moments from her past campaigns, projecting confidence and continuity. Her posture and expression suggested someone prepared to reclaim a narrative she believed had been unfairly taken from her. To her supporters, she looked resolute, ready to confront a rival they viewed as a historical anomaly. Few in the room doubted that she intended to use the opening minutes to define the moral frame of the night. Donald Trump followed several minutes later to a louder and more prolonged reaction, his supporters rising to their feet and chanting his name. He moved deliberately to the podium, acknowledging the crowd with practiced ease and an unmistakable sense of ownership over the moment. What drew immediate attention, however, was not his demeanor, but the stack of thick binders placed beside him. The visual alone unsettled some observers, recalling past moments when prepared materials had signaled an aggressive strategy. Clinton noticed them as well, and for the first time that evening, her expression flickered with uncertainty. The moderator outlined the rules, emphasizing civility, time limits, and a focus on issues rather than personal attacks. The reminder landed awkwardly, given the history between the two participants and the expectations that had built up around the event. When it came time for opening statements, Clinton did not hesitate. She launched into a tightly scripted address that framed Trump as a threat to democratic norms and the rule of law. Her words were met with applause from her supporters, reinforcing her belief that she had seized the initiative. Then came the line she had clearly been waiting to deliver. She turned toward Trump and declared that history would judge him as a criminal unfit for the office he once held. The statement was sharp, direct, and designed to resonate far beyond the studio walls. For a brief moment, it appeared to land as intended, drawing cheers and nods from those already inclined to agree. Trump's response, however, shifted the tone almost instantly. He smiled, not in amusement, but with the expression of someone who had just been handed an opening he was eager to exploit. His reply began lightly, with a quip that drew laughter from parts of the audience and briefly eased the tension. Then he reached for the first binder and signaled to the production booth. Images appeared on the screens behind them, transforming the set into something resembling a presentation rather than a debate. From that point on, the exchange moved in a direction few had anticipated. Instead of countering Clinton's accusation with a general denial, Trump began asking narrow, specific questions. He framed them as matters of fact, often demanding simple yes or no answers. The approach immediately put Clinton on the defensive, forcing her to respond to details she had hoped would remain abstract. Each answer seemed to lead to another document, another timeline, another visual meant to reinforce his narrative. The rhythm of the exchange left little room for her to pivot back to her original theme. As the minutes passed, it became clear that Trump was not improvising. The sequence of points followed a deliberate order, each building on the last to create a cumulative effect. Supporters in the audience reacted audibly, while even some skeptics watched with visible unease. Clinton attempted to contextualize and explain, but the format favored whoever controlled the flow of material on the screens. By the end of the opening segment, the debate had already drifted far from its planned structure. What was unfolding was not simply a clash of personalities, but a collision between two fundamentally different strategies. Clinton had come prepared to argue character and consequence, assuming the broader public narrative was on her side. Trump had arrived intent on revisiting unresolved controversies in granular detail, betting that repetition and documentation would carry the night. The contrast left the moderator struggling to regain control and the audience unsure whether they were witnessing a debate or something else entirely. As the first major exchange concluded, it was evident that the evening was only beginning, and that the stakes were far higher than either side had publicly acknowledged. Clinton tried to steady herself by returning to the language she knew best, the careful phrasing that signals experience and control without conceding an inch. She referenced prior reviews, official statements, and the kind of institutional conclusions that, in her view, should have ended the conversation years ago. But Trump kept narrowing the frame, pressing for plain admissions rather than explanations, and the audience could feel the difference. It was less about who had the better argument, and more about who could force the other person to answer on unfavorable terms. Every time she reached for context, He snapped the exchange back to a single detail on the screen. He asked about the private email system in a way that left no space for rhetorical escape. He did not describe it as a complicated era of evolving technology or a mistake made amid imperfect guidance. He presented it as a simple decision with simple consequences, and he insisted on treating it that way. Clinton answered with the tight caution of someone who has lived inside that controversy for years. Her words were measured, but the pause before them told the audience she understood the trap. Trump moved immediately to the topic of deleted messages, citing timelines that have long circulated in partisan arguments and media coverage. He described it as an act that looked, to his supporters, like the kind of thing ordinary people would be punished for. Clinton pushed back with the familiar claim that the matter had been investigated, reviewed, and closed in the legal sense. Trump dismissed the closure as proof of a double standard rather than proof of resolution, which is the interpretation his base has always preferred. In that moment, the studio became a mirror of the broader country, with each side hearing the same words and drawing opposite conclusions. The moderator attempted to redirect to issues like inflation, foreign policy, and public trust, but the temperature in the room had already risen. Trump waved off the transition, arguing that trust could not be discussed without revisiting the controversies he believed defined Clinton's public life. Clinton's supporters murmured their frustration, while Trump's side responded as if every document displayed behind him was a verdict. The event's format began to break down as the audience reacted louder and more frequently, pulling attention away from the moderator. It was the kind of moment television producers secretly love and debate moderators dread. Clinton tried to reclaim momentum by noting that political opponents routinely weaponize investigations and selectively cite documents. She framed Trump's approach as performance, not substance, and described it as an attempt to relitigate the past instead of addressing the present. Trump countered by insisting that the past was the present because it shaped whether voters believed anything she promised. He kept repeating the word receipts, a rhetorical move that implies not just claims but proof, even when the underlying disputes remain complex. The repetition worked on the crowd because it sounded like finality. Then he pivoted toward the Clinton Foundation, a subject that has fueled years of allegations, reporting, rebuttals, and competing interpretations. He spoke as if the foundation's fundraising and donor relationships were inherently incriminating, which is a viewpoint common in some conservative circles. Clinton responded by emphasizing charitable work, global health initiatives, and the idea that public figures often become targets precisely because they do high-profile work. Trump was not interested in the mission statements or the humanitarian framing, and he steered the conversation toward money flows and optics. He asked questions that were built to sound like indictments, even when they were phrased as debate points. On the screens, lists of countries and donors appeared, pulled from publicly discussed records and the kind of summaries that often circulate in political media. Trump described the pattern as pay to play, a label that carries a heavy accusation even when it is debated by experts and contested by the people involved. Clinton called the characterization misleading, arguing that donations and policy actions do not automatically establish causation. Trump replied that politics is not a courtroom and that voters do not need a judge to recognize what looks wrong to them. That line landed with his base because it validated suspicion as a kind of truth. The moderator tried again to bring the discussion back to policy, but the energy had shifted toward the spectacle of confrontation. Clinton began to look less like a candidate delivering her message and more like a witness trying to avoid stepping into rhetorical quicksand. Trump, by contrast, looked energized by the friction, as if each denial from Clinton only fed his next point. The audience reactions made it harder for her to regain command, because pauses and hesitations were instantly amplified by noise and chants. Even when she delivered solid counterpoints, the room's momentum often swallowed them. From there, Trump moved into the Uranium One controversy, a topic that has been argued for years across talk radio, investigative pieces, rebuttal articles, and fact-check segments. He presented it as a clean storyline of influence and money, framing it as the kind of narrative viewers can grasp in seconds. Clinton responded by stressing that the decision involved multiple agencies and processes, not a single official signing a single paper. Trump treated that as an evasion and framed it as the classic Washington defense of spreading responsibility to avoid accountability. The exchange highlighted a core problem of live television, where complexity often loses to clarity. Clinton attempted to introduce nuance, pointing out that not every widely repeated timeline proves wrongdoing, and that many such stories collapse under careful scrutiny. Trump's strategy was to keep the conversation moving so quickly that scrutiny became difficult in real time, which is a common tactic in high-conflict media. He did not need to win every factual dispute to win the moment, because the visual of binders and screens suggested preparation and certainty. Clinton's supporters could see the tactic, but the undecided viewers in the middle were watching the performance as much as the content. For them, the question was not just what was true, but who looked more confident saying it. The conversation then shifted toward Benghazi, a subject that still evokes strong emotion and deep disagreement about responsibility and narrative. Trump spoke about it with solemnity and anger, emphasizing loss, tragedy, and the idea that leadership failures have human costs. Clinton acknowledged the tragedy and referenced the multiple investigations, a familiar response that has been both defended and criticized over the years. Trump seized on the emotional dimension, arguing that institutional findings do not erase the moral weight of what happened. As he spoke, the studio quieted, and even some of Clinton's supporters stopped reacting and simply watched. At that point, the event's purpose had fully transformed in the eyes of the audience. It was no longer a forward-looking debate so much as a referendum on two legacies, told through the sharpest versions of each side's narratives. Clinton had tried to open the night by putting Trump on the defensive, but she was now spending much of her time answering his framing. Trump had successfully turned the word criminal into a weapon against her, not by proving anything in a legal sense, but by weaponizing public doubt. And as the clock moved forward, it became clear he was revealing points in a sequence, not reacting in the moment. He ended this stretch by hinting that the biggest moment was still ahead, teasing a reveal the way a showrunner teases a cliffhanger. Clinton glanced toward the screens, then toward the moderator, as if looking for an exit back to policy and away from the archival battlefield. The moderator announced a brief transition, but the audience noise didn't settle because the room sensed the next wave coming. Trump adjusted the stack of binders as if preparing to continue a case file, not a debate. And Clinton, for the first time, looked like someone realizing that the night's script belonged to her opponent. Trump did not rush the next segment, and the pause itself felt intentional, as though he wanted the anticipation to do some of the work for him. When he spoke again, his tone softened just enough to suggest gravity rather than aggression, which made the audience lean in. He framed what followed as a matter of accountability rather than accusation, a distinction that sounded important even if it remained contested. Clinton straightened her posture, preparing for another round of defense, but the room already felt tilted against her. The sense that something consequential was unfolding had replaced the earlier buzz of partisan cheering. He turned to the topic of public trust, asking whether voters could reasonably believe leaders who operate by one set of rules while others live by another. The question was not aimed at policy, but at perception, which is often far more powerful in televised politics. Clinton answered by arguing that public service invites scrutiny precisely because decisions are complex and often unpopular. Trump countered that complexity should not excuse behavior that would end careers outside of Washington. The exchange crystallized the gap between institutional logic and populist resentment. As the discussion moved on, Trump brought up paid speeches and the influence of major financial institutions, an issue that has long divided progressive rhetoric and elite practice. He described the speaking circuit as a revolving door that rewards proximity to power rather than service to voters. Clinton responded by noting that former officials across parties engage in similar work, framing it as a normalized aspect of public life. Trump rejected normalization as a defense, arguing that widespread behavior is not the same as ethical behavior. The crowd reacted unevenly, reflecting how familiar yet unresolved the argument remains. Clinton attempted to pivot toward her policy agenda, mentioning health care, education, and international cooperation. Her words were fluent and confident, sounding like the speeches she has delivered for decades. But Trump interrupted to ask why those priorities always seem to coexist with lucrative private arrangements. The interruption drew protests from Clinton's supporters and cheers from his own, further eroding the moderator's control. What might have been a substantive policy moment dissolved back into confrontation. The screens behind them flashed with quotes and figures that had circulated widely in political media, presented in a way designed to feel definitive. Trump spoke as if he were narrating a documentary, guiding viewers through a story he believed explained everything. Clinton challenged the framing, arguing that selective presentation distorts reality and feeds cynicism. Trump replied that cynicism exists because people feel they have been misled too many times. The moment underscored how trust, once broken, is almost impossible to repair in real time. The audience's reactions grew more polarized as the night wore on, with chants occasionally drowning out attempts at moderation. Clinton appealed to viewers at home, urging them to look beyond the spectacle and consider experience and stability. Trump appealed to the same viewers by insisting that experience without accountability leads to stagnation and abuse. Each spoke past the other, aiming not to persuade their opponent, but to activate their own coalitions. The debate had become less about dialogue and more about mobilization. As Trump revisited familiar controversies, he framed them as unresolved questions rather than settled matters. Clinton responded by emphasizing that investigations exist precisely to resolve such questions, not to provide endless fodder. Trump argued that conclusions reached behind closed doors do not always satisfy a public that feels excluded. That argument resonated with those who already distrust institutions, even as it frustrated those who rely on them. The exchange illustrated why the same facts can deepen division rather than resolve it. The moderator attempted to insert a question about foreign policy challenges ahead, hoping to redirect attention. Clinton welcomed the shift, speaking about alliances, diplomacy, and America's role in the world. Trump listened briefly before reframing the issue as one of credibility, asking how allies can trust leaders accused of double standards. The reframing dragged the conversation back into the same orbit it had never truly left. Even attempts to move forward kept circling the past. As the hour mark approached, fatigue began to show, not just on the candidates, but on the room itself. Clinton's answers remained composed, but the cumulative effect of constant rebuttal weighed on her delivery. Trump appeared energized by repetition, using it to reinforce the themes he wanted viewers to remember. The contrast created an impression, fair or not, that one side was reacting while the other was directing. In television politics, impressions often matter as much as substance. The conversation briefly touched on media coverage, with Trump accusing major outlets of shielding Clinton from scrutiny. Clinton defended the press as imperfect but essential, warning against narratives that undermine shared reality. Trump responded that skepticism toward media does not erase facts, it demands them. The argument drew applause from his supporters, who see media criticism as validation of their own doubts. For Clinton's side, it felt like another attempt to delegitimize any source that challenged Trump's framing. As the segment closed, it was clear that neither candidate had shifted the other's position. What had shifted was the emotional temperature of the event, now heavy with accusation and defensiveness. Clinton had hoped to close the night with a moral indictment, but that opening move now felt distant. Trump had succeeded in keeping the focus on a set of controversies that defined his critique of her career. The question looming over the studio was no longer who would win the argument, but how viewers would interpret what they had just seen. When the moderator announced the next transition, the room exhaled but did not relax. Both candidates adjusted their notes, aware that the final stretches often leave the strongest impressions. Clinton glanced toward the audience as if seeking reassurance beyond her supporters' section. Trump remained fixed on his materials, projecting readiness rather than reflection. Whatever came next would determine not just headlines, but the story people would tell about the night itself. The fourth phase of the night began with a noticeable shift in pacing, as if both candidates sensed that the closing arc was approaching. Trump leaned into summary mode, revisiting earlier points with sharper phrasing and fewer qualifiers. Clinton attempted to interrupt the pattern by reframing the discussion as a choice between governing styles rather than personal histories. She spoke about institutions, norms, and the idea that democracy depends on restraint as much as confrontation. The appeal sounded principled, but it struggled to dislodge the momentum that had already set in. Trump responded by arguing that restraint without accountability becomes protection for insiders. He framed his critique as a response to voter frustration rather than personal animus, a move designed to broaden its appeal. Clinton countered that outrage is easy to manufacture and harder to govern with. The exchange highlighted a familiar fault line between populist energy and technocratic caution. Neither side conceded ground, and the audience reactions followed predictable lines. As the moderator pressed for concise answers, Trump condensed years of arguments into a handful of phrases meant to linger. He repeated themes of double standards and selective enforcement, emphasizing how they feel to ordinary citizens. Clinton challenged the fairness of judging complex decisions through simplified narratives. Trump replied that narratives become simplified when leaders refuse transparency. The back and forth felt less like discovery and more like reinforcement. Clinton attempted once more to pivot toward the future, outlining what she described as pragmatic solutions to current challenges. Her delivery was confident, the cadence familiar to anyone who had followed her career. Trump listened, then asked why similar promises in the past had coincided with so much controversy. The question reframed her policy vision as a continuation rather than a correction. It was an effective rhetorical move, even if it sidestepped the substance of her proposals. The screens behind them continued to display excerpts and figures, now serving more as visual reminders than fresh revelations. Trump treated them as a backdrop to his argument, rather than the argument itself. Clinton argued that governing cannot be reduced to slides and sound bites. Trump answered that slides and sound bites exist because people have limited patience for explanations that never resolve doubt. The exchange underscored the tension between depth and immediacy in televised politics. At one point, Clinton addressed viewers directly, urging them to separate spectacle from reality. She warned that politics driven by grievance can erode trust just as surely as corruption can. Trump replied that trust erodes fastest when people believe leaders are insulated from consequences. The audience reacted loudly, turning the moment into another measure of partisan strength. The moderator waited for quiet that never fully arrived. As the minutes ticked down, both candidates began to circle toward their closing messages. Clinton emphasized experience, resilience, and the belief that public service should be judged by outcomes rather than accusations. Trump emphasized disruption, accountability, and the idea that entrenched power resists exposure. Each message was coherent on its own, but incompatible with the other. The debate offered no synthesis, only contrast. The emotional weight of the night had clearly taken its toll. Clinton maintained composure, but the strain showed in her voice and pacing. Trump appeared energized by repetition, using it to harden the impressions he wanted viewers to carry forward. Supporters on both sides sensed that minds were unlikely to be changed, only reinforced. What remained was the final impression, the story that would dominate coverage. The moderator announced that closing statements were approaching, prompting a brief lull. Both candidates adjusted their stance, aware that the last words often overshadow everything before them. Clinton looked determined to reclaim moral ground, even if she could not reset the entire narrative. Trump looked satisfied, as if he believed the case had already been made. The studio quieted just enough to signal that the night was reaching its decisive moment. As the closing segment began, the tension in the room felt heavier than at any earlier point in the night. The audience sensed that whatever was said next would frame how the entire event would be remembered. Clinton took a measured breath, clearly aware that she needed to rise above the barrage rather than respond to it point by point. She spoke about endurance, about remaining in public life long enough to be defined by more than controversy. Her tone aimed for steadiness, as if to reassure viewers who wanted calm rather than combat. She argued that democracy is sustained not by perpetual confrontation, but by institutions that outlast individual figures. Her words emphasized responsibility, restraint, and the importance of measured leadership in uncertain times. She acknowledged mistakes without conceding the darker interpretations placed upon them by her critics. The appeal was directed less at her opponent and more at viewers fatigued by years of political warfare. It was a plea for perspective rather than vindication. Trump followed with a closing that echoed the structure of his entire performance. He returned to the idea that unanswered questions linger because they were never fully confronted. He framed his message as a defense of skepticism, not hostility, and of inquiry rather than accusation. The repetition of his themes gave them a sense of finality, regardless of where one stood on their merits. For his supporters, it felt like a summation rather than an argument. He spoke about feeling ignored by systems that appeared distant and unaccountable to everyday citizens. He insisted that challenging powerful figures is not destabilizing, but necessary for public confidence. The language was populist, but controlled, designed to sound resolute rather than incendiary. He avoided personal insults in the final stretch, focusing instead on what he described as unresolved doubts. The shift in tone suggested an awareness of how closing impressions linger. The moderator thanked both participants, signaling the formal end of the event. Applause broke out unevenly, reflecting the divided reactions that had defined the night. Supporters on each side interpreted the same moments as either validation or provocation. Camera shots captured faces ranging from energized to unsettled, underscoring how differently the exchange had landed. The broadcast cut away, but the debate was clearly far from over. Within minutes, clips began circulating across platforms, each emphasizing a different narrative. Commentators framed the night as either a reckoning long delayed or a spectacle long regretted. Some praised the confrontation as overdue transparency, while others criticized it as corrosive theater. Fact checks, opinion pieces, and reaction videos followed in rapid succession. The event became a canvas onto which existing beliefs were projected. For Clinton, the aftermath brought renewed scrutiny rather than closure. For Trump, it reinforced his image as an unfiltered challenger to established power. Neither emerged unscathed, and neither fully controlled how the night would be interpreted. What was clear was that the exchange reopened debates many believed had faded with time. It reminded viewers that political legacies are rarely settled, only revisited. In the days that followed, analysts debated not just who performed better, but what the performance revealed. They examined how preparation, framing, and tone can shape perception more than facts alone. The debate was cited as an example of how modern political encounters blur the line between argument and spectacle. It was discussed in classrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms as a case study in media-driven confrontation. The question shifted from who won to what the night said about the state of public discourse. Ultimately, the event did not resolve the long-standing rivalry it showcased. Instead, it crystallized the divisions that have defined recent political history. Supporters on both sides felt confirmed rather than converted. The debate entered the archive as another chapter in a story that refuses to end cleanly. And for viewers, it served as a reminder that in modern politics, closure is elusive, and every confrontation leaves echoes that last long after the cameras stop rolling. The immediate aftermath of the broadcast revealed how deeply the event had tapped into unresolved tensions rather than settling them. Newsrooms scrambled to frame the debate in ways that matched their audience's expectations. Some outlets emphasized preparation and performance, while others focused on tone and implication. What none could deny was the scale of attention the confrontation had generated. It dominated the news cycle with a force that surprised even seasoned observers. Social media amplified every moment, slicing the debate into clips that traveled far beyond its original context. Each fragment took on a life of its own, shared with captions that hardened interpretation before viewers even pressed play. Supporters on both sides treated these clips as proof rather than excerpts. Arguments erupted not just over what was said, but over what it meant and what it revealed. The platform algorithms rewarded intensity, ensuring the loudest reactions spread fastest. Clinton's allies moved quickly to contextualize the night, releasing statements that emphasized experience and resilience. They argued that revisiting old controversies served political theater rather than public interest. Surrogates appeared on cable panels, urging viewers to separate documented conclusions from rhetorical framing. Their message was consistent, but it struggled to compete with the immediacy of viral moments. In the modern media environment, explanations rarely travel as far as accusations. Trump's supporters, by contrast, treated the debate as confirmation of long-held suspicions. They praised his preparation and described the binders and screens as symbols of diligence. To them, the event felt like a reversal of years in which they believed their concerns had been dismissed. The language of accountability dominated their reactions, even when interpretations varied. What mattered most was the sense that their grievances had finally been aired on a large stage. Polling in the days that followed reflected more reinforcement than persuasion. Those already inclined toward Trump reported feeling validated, while Clinton's supporters remained largely unmoved. Undecided viewers showed modest shifts, often citing tone and confidence rather than specific arguments. Analysts noted that debates rarely change minds in polarized environments, but they can solidify narratives. This event appeared to do exactly that. Academic observers weighed in as well, treating the debate as a case study in modern political communication. They pointed out how visual aids and rapid sequencing can overwhelm nuance. Others focused on the power of framing questions rather than answering them. The exchange illustrated how live television rewards assertiveness even when substance is contested. For students of media, it was a vivid example of performance shaping perception. Clinton's own response in the following days was restrained. She avoided extended commentary, limiting herself to brief statements that emphasized moving forward. The choice signaled an awareness that further engagement might only prolong the cycle. Critics interpreted the silence in different ways, some as dignity, others as concession. In politics, absence often invites interpretation as much as presence. Trump, meanwhile, referenced the debate selectively, allowing supporters and commentators to do much of the amplification. He framed it as a moment of clarity, rather than confrontation. By not over-explaining, he allowed his audience to project their own conclusions onto the event. The strategy aligned with his broader communication style, which often relies on implication. Silence, in this context, became another rhetorical tool. As weeks passed, the debate settled into the background of ongoing political discourse. It resurfaced whenever discussions turned to accountability, trust, or media bias. Clips were replayed, quotes revisited, and interpretations refined. Yet no definitive verdict emerged, only a collection of competing stories. The rivalry it showcased remained unresolved, but newly energized. In hindsight, the event demonstrated how difficult closure has become in contemporary politics. Even moments designed to settle scores often end up reopening wounds. The debate did not rewrite history, but it reshaped how that history was argued. For viewers, it offered not answers, but a mirror reflecting their own assumptions. And as with most political spectacles, its true impact lay less in what was said than in what people believed they saw. The debate's aftershocks continued to ripple through political conversations long after the initial reactions faded. Talk shows returned to the footage repeatedly, each replay framed with new commentary and fresh emphasis. What began as analysis gradually hardened into narrative, with each side settling on a version that felt definitive to them. The same exchanges were described as either overdue scrutiny or calculated distraction, depending on the speaker. Time did not resolve the disagreement, it only clarified where lines had already been drawn. Among undecided viewers, the most common response was not outrage, but exhaustion. Many described feeling overwhelmed by the volume of claims and counterclaims compressed into a single night. They spoke less about specific facts and more about tone, demeanor, and perceived authenticity. For them, the binders and screens symbolized preparation, but also a sense that politics had become performative. The debate reinforced a feeling that clarity is increasingly elusive in public life. Media critics focused on the mechanics of the broadcast itself. They examined how camera angles, reaction shots, and timing shaped audience perception. Moments of hesitation were magnified, while confident delivery appeared decisive regardless of content. The format rewarded certainty over reflection, speed over deliberation. In that sense, the debate was less an exchange of ideas than a demonstration of media dynamics. Clinton's long career became a focal point of retrospection in the weeks that followed. Supporters highlighted decades of public service and policy expertise that could not be erased by a single night. Critics argued that longevity without trust becomes a liability rather than an asset. Both perspectives drew from the same history but told very different stories about its meaning. The debate served as a catalyst for that reassessment. Trump's role in the event was interpreted through the lens of his broader political persona. To admirers, he appeared disciplined and methodical, a departure from his more improvisational image. To detractors, the performance confirmed their view of him as confrontational and reductive. The contrast underscored how political figures rarely escape the frames already built around them. A single performance can reinforce, but seldom redefine, those frames. In academic and civic settings, the debate sparked discussions about accountability versus presumption. Some argued that public figures must continually answer for past actions, regardless of prior reviews. Others warned that endless revisiting of controversies undermines institutional processes designed to resolve them. The tension between these positions reflects a broader struggle within democratic societies. The event did not settle the argument, but it brought it into sharper relief. As the political calendar moved forward, new issues competed for attention. Economic pressures, international conflicts, and domestic policy debates reclaimed the headlines. Yet references to the debate surfaced whenever questions of credibility arose. It became shorthand for a style of confrontation rather than a single set of claims. In that way, its influence lingered even as focus shifted elsewhere. Observers noted that the debate illustrated how modern politics often operates on parallel tracks. Facts and interpretations travel side by side without intersecting. Audiences choose which track to follow based on identity as much as information. The result is not consensus, but coexistence of incompatible conclusions. The event exemplified that reality more clearly than most. Looking back, the debate may be remembered less for changing minds than for revealing how fixed many minds already were. It showed how preparation and presentation can dominate substance in high-stakes media moments. It highlighted the limits of live confrontation as a tool for resolution. Most of all, it underscored the persistence of division in a landscape where trust is scarce. The echoes of that night remain, not as answers, but as reminders of how deeply contested the political narrative has become. The conversation around the debate gradually shifted from immediate reaction to longer reflection. Commentators began asking not what had been proven, but why moments like this resonate so strongly. They pointed to a public hunger for confrontation that feels decisive even when it settles little. The spectacle satisfied an emotional demand for clarity in a landscape crowded with uncertainty. That demand, they argued, is shaping how political events are staged and consumed. Civic groups discussed the implications for voter engagement and trust. Some worried that relentless focus on controversy discourages participation by making politics feel irredeemably hostile. Others believed confrontation draws attention that quieter discussions never could. Both views acknowledged the same reality, that attention has become a currency as valuable as persuasion. The debate illustrated how easily attention can be captured and how difficult it is to redirect. In classrooms, instructors used excerpts to illustrate rhetorical strategy rather than policy substance. Students analyzed how framing, repetition, and visual reinforcement influence perception. They noted how questions can function as accusations without ever stating them outright. The exercise revealed how media literacy is increasingly essential to civic understanding. The debate became a teaching tool for how arguments are constructed, as much as for what they contain. Political strategists studied the event for lessons about preparation and risk. Some concluded that exhaustive documentation can dominate a stage if the opponent is forced into response mode. Others warned that such an approach can backfire if audiences perceive it as obsessive or punitive. The effectiveness depends on context, timing, and the existing mood of the electorate. In this case, the mood was already primed for conflict. Clinton's retreat from the spotlight was interpreted through competing narratives. Supporters described it as a deliberate step back from a media environment that rewards distortion. Critics framed it as evidence that the confrontation had struck deeper than expected. The truth likely lay somewhere between, shaped by personal calculation as much as public pressure. Absence became another element for commentators to interpret. Trump's continued prominence ensured that references to the debate remained alive. He alluded to it indirectly, allowing others to fill in the meaning. The restraint contrasted with the intensity of the performance itself. It suggested confidence that the impression had already been set. In political communication, leaving space can be as powerful as filling it. As months passed, the debate's specifics blurred, but its tone endured. People remembered how it felt more than what was said. The sense of confrontation, the visual drama, and the emotional charge lingered in memory. Details faded, but the impression of conflict remained vivid. That is often how political spectacles survive over time. The event also prompted reflection on the role of televised debates in an era of fragmentation. When audiences consume content through clips and commentary, the original exchange becomes secondary. Meaning is reconstructed through repetition and reaction. The debate existed simultaneously as an event and as thousands of reinterpretations. Each viewer encountered a slightly different version. In that sense, the debate was less a single moment than a process. It unfolded across platforms, timelines, and conversations. Its impact depended on where and how people encountered it. No single narrative could contain it fully. The multiplicity of interpretations became part of its legacy. Ultimately, the continuation of the story rested not with the candidates, but with the audience. Viewers carried their own histories, biases, and expectations into the experience. They left with those same frameworks largely intact. The debate did not end arguments, it extended them. And in doing so, it reflected a political culture defined not by resolution, but by endurance. The endurance of those arguments became evident as the debate continued to be referenced in unexpected places. Casual conversations echoed talking points first heard on that stage. Online discussions treated moments from the broadcast as shorthand for broader beliefs. The event slipped into cultural memory not as a conclusion, but as a reference point. It became a symbol of how disputes now persist rather than conclude. Observers noted how the debate blurred the boundary between accountability and entertainment. The production values, pacing, and visual elements mirrored primetime programming more than civic deliberation. This blending raised questions about whether seriousness is conveyed through substance or spectacle. Some argued that spectacle undermines credibility, while others claimed it is the only way to command attention. The debate embodied that unresolved tension. Public fatigue surfaced alongside continued interest. Many viewers expressed a desire for closure while simultaneously engaging with every new clip. The contradiction reflected a deeper ambivalence about political conflict. People wanted resolution, but were drawn to confrontation. The debate satisfied one impulse while frustrating the other. In think tanks and policy forums, the focus turned to consequences rather than claims. Analysts discussed how moments like this shape institutional trust over time. They questioned whether repeated confrontations harden skepticism or encourage scrutiny. The answers varied, but the concern was shared. Trust, once strained, is difficult to restore through performance alone. The candidates themselves receded into their established roles. Clinton became a reference in discussions about legacy and the cost of prolonged public life. Trump remained a catalyst, his presence continuing to polarize and mobilize. Neither escaped the gravity of the confrontation. It lingered as part of their public identities. Media organizations reassessed their role in staging such events. Some defended the debate as a service to viewers hungry for direct exchange. Others questioned whether the format amplified division more than understanding. Internal discussions weighed ratings against responsibility. The answers were pragmatic rather than philosophical. For many viewers, the lasting lesson was not about either candidate, but about the system that produced the moment. They saw how incentives shape behavior on stage and off. They recognized how narratives are rewarded when they provoke strong reactions. The debate offered a glimpse into those mechanics. Understanding them became as important as judging the participants. As time passed, references to the event grew more abstract. It was invoked as an example rather than revisited in detail. The name of the debate stood in for a style of politics marked by confrontation and distrust. Its specifics mattered less than what it represented. That abstraction ensured its longevity. In the end, the continuation of the story depended on collective memory. What people chose to remember shaped what the debate became. Some remembered challenge, others chaos, others catharsis. Each memory reinforced a different conclusion. Together, they formed a portrait of a political moment defined not by answers, but by persistence. The persistence of that moment revealed something fundamental about how political meaning is constructed now. Events no longer end when the broadcast does. They continue through repetition and reinterpretation. Every retelling emphasizes a different angle, shaped by who is speaking and why. The debate became raw material rather than a finished product. Its significance grew through circulation, not conclusion. Viewers who revisited the footage often noticed different details the second or third time. Some focused on body language, others on phrasing, others on what was left unsaid. The multiplicity of readings made it impossible to settle on a single takeaway. What felt decisive in the moment later appeared ambiguous. Memory softened certainty into impression. Political commentators began using the debate as a benchmark. They compared later confrontations to its intensity and structure. Anything less dramatic felt muted by comparison. The event reset expectations for what a high-profile exchange should look like. It raised the bar for confrontation rather than dialogue. The debate also exposed the limits of preparation in an unpredictable environment. Extensive planning can dominate a stage, but it cannot fully control reception. Audiences bring their own frameworks, filtering information before it lands. No amount of documentation guarantees persuasion. The gap between evidence and belief remained. In private conversations, some voters expressed a sense of resignation. They felt that no debate could truly resolve their doubts anymore. Others admitted that spectacle had replaced substance in their engagement. The event did not create these feelings, but it highlighted them. It held up a mirror to civic frustration. Younger viewers, encountering such a confrontation for the first time, reacted differently. Many saw it as confirmation that politics is inherently adversarial. They questioned whether consensus was even possible. The debate shaped their expectations before they had fully formed opinions. First impressions carry weight. For educators and organizers, the challenge became how to channel attention into understanding. They grappled with turning interest sparked by conflict into sustained civic learning. The debate provided an entry point, but not a roadmap. It showed what draws eyes, not what builds trust. Bridging that gap remained unresolved. As months turned into a year, the debate's presence faded from headlines, but not from rhetoric. References surfaced during campaigns, interviews, and commentary. It was invoked as proof, warning, or precedent. The night itself receded, but its shadow remained. Political memory is selective, but it is rarely empty. Ultimately, the continuation of the story was not about who spoke better or who prepared more thoroughly. It was about how audiences processed what they saw. The debate demonstrated that meaning is negotiated, not delivered. Each viewer completed the event in their own mind, and that collective process ensured the conversation would continue long after the stage was cleared. The continuation of that conversation revealed how political moments now function less as conclusions and more as catalysts. They spark chains of interpretation that move independently of the original exchange. People discuss not just what happened, but how it made them feel about institutions, leaders, and themselves. Emotion becomes a lens through which facts are filtered. The debate operated squarely within that dynamic. Over time, the specifics of the night blended into broader themes about power and accountability. Names and dates mattered less than the impression of confrontation. For some, the event symbolized overdue challenge, while for others, it represented deepening distrust. Both reactions drew from the same source. The divergence underscored how shared experiences can yield opposing conclusions. Analysts began to describe the debate as an inflection point rather than a turning point. It did not redirect the political landscape, but it sharpened existing contours. Positions that were once implicit became explicit. Silences became meaningful, and emphasis became evidence. The exchange clarified where lines stood, even if it did not move them. In subsequent months, politicians across the spectrum adjusted their messaging. Some adopted more confrontational styles, believing audiences rewarded certainty. Others leaned into restraint, hoping to appeal to those exhausted by conflict. Both strategies traced their logic back to moments like that debate. The event influenced tone as much as content. The role of moderation also came under renewed scrutiny. Observers questioned whether traditional formats can function in such charged environments. Calls emerged for new approaches that balance accountability with coherence. Yet proposals remained abstract, struggling against the pull of spectacle. Change proved harder than critique. For viewers reflecting on the debate long after it aired, memory distilled complexity into symbols. A binder, a pause, a raised voice became shorthand for entire arguments. These fragments carried meaning disproportionate to their original context. They circulated because they were easy to remember. Simplicity proved more durable than nuance. The debate's legacy thus became less about persuasion and more about affirmation. People returned to it to confirm what they already believed. It offered reinforcement rather than revelation. That function, while limited, was powerful. It explained why the event continued to be cited even when its details faded. As the political cycle advanced, new controversies emerged and demanded attention. Yet the debate lingered as a reference point for how confrontation unfolds in public view. It shaped expectations about preparedness, aggression, and control of narrative. Candidates and audiences alike internalized those lessons. The influence was subtle but persistent. In the end, the debate did not resolve questions about trust, truth, or accountability. It illuminated how those questions are argued rather than answered. The night became part of a larger story about democratic discourse under pressure. Its meaning evolved as it was revisited, and that evolution ensured it would remain relevant, not as a verdict, but as a mirror of its time. What lingered most after the debate was not any single claim, but the realization of how difficult resolution has become in modern political life. Viewers were left with the sense that even exhaustive confrontation does not necessarily lead to shared understanding. Instead, it often reinforces parallel realities that coexist without touching. The event highlighted how debates now function less as forums for persuasion and more as mirrors for existing beliefs. That shift explains why reactions were so intense and so divided. Public discourse in the weeks that followed reflected this fragmentation. Commentary rarely focused on changing minds, but on energizing bases and solidifying narratives. The debate was cited as evidence by opposing sides for entirely opposite conclusions. Each interpretation felt internally coherent, even when mutually exclusive. The absence of consensus became the defining outcome. Sociologists noted that such moments feed into a broader pattern of political identity formation. People align not only around policies, but around interpretations of events. Agreement on facts becomes secondary to agreement on meaning. The debate served as a case study in how meaning is negotiated socially rather than determined objectively. That process is slow, recursive, and rarely final. For many citizens, the experience deepened a sense of distance from traditional political processes. They watched highly produced confrontation and wondered how much of governance resembles performance. The distinction between accountability and theater felt increasingly blurred. Trust, already fragile, was strained further by the sense that no definitive answers emerge. The debate intensified questions rather than resolving them. At the same time, others found the confrontation cathartic. They felt that long-suppressed grievances had finally been voiced without mediation. For them, the debate was not about closure, but about recognition. Being seen and acknowledged mattered more than consensus. That emotional response explained why the event resonated so powerfully with certain audiences. Political leaders observed these reactions closely. They saw how forceful framing and visual confidence could dominate attention. They also saw how restraint risked being interpreted as weakness. Future messaging strategies absorbed those lessons. The debate quietly reshaped incentives beyond the stage. In retrospect, the night illustrated how politics increasingly operates in cycles rather than arcs. Moments of confrontation rise, peak, and echo without leading to resolution. Each cycle leaves impressions rather than conclusions. Those impressions accumulate, shaping public memory. The debate became one such layer in a growing archive of unresolved moments. What ultimately endured was not agreement, but awareness. Viewers became more conscious of how narratives are built and contested. Some grew more skeptical, others more committed. Few felt genuinely persuaded to cross ideological lines. The event underscored how persuasion has become the rarest outcome of all. If the debate taught anything enduring, it was that modern political confrontation is less about winning arguments than about sustaining identities. It showed how evidence, emotion, and performance intertwine on the public stage. It revealed the limits of live confrontation in an era of deep mistrust, and it reminded audiences that political meaning is never delivered whole, only assembled afterward. That ongoing assembly is where the real debate now lives.